in stoves that they fired and fueled themselves. Most people still lived in the countryside. Most people still lived off the land. Most people were engaged in farming, so women's chores included things like killing chickens, butchering hogs, putting up pork and beef in brine, making pickles, sauces, and preserves and jams by hand. Today, the average grocery store contains about 8,000 items that Americans regard as necessary for running a household. The average family in 1750 got by with about a dozen. The routines and practices of daily life in the 18th century were largely the same wherever you went, because pretty much all of America, all of the Americas, lived in what historians have called the household economy, at least in North America. And here's a typical example of how the household economy worked. In 1756, Samuel and Hannah Swain lived in Chester County, Pennsylvania. That's a few miles southwest of Philadelphia. Samuel's parents were prosperous merchants. They were Quakers, in fact. Sorry, they were prosperous Quakers. They weren't merchants. They were prosperous Quakers. They provided well for their children. The result was that when Samuel married, he received a 91-acre farm. Over time, he expanded and improved his holdings. He hired workers, though later he relied mainly on the labor of his 8 children, at least the 8 who made it into adulthood. The Swain farm grew a wide variety of crops, and it tended a wide variety of animals. After making certain that he had enough food to feed his family, Samuel planted some acres in wheat. That was his main cash crop, the main source of income. Still, to be on the safe side, he also planted corn, he raised oats and barley, he raised potatoes, which he fed both to his family and to livestock. He grew hay for his horses and cows. He grew flax for spinning, to linen, and for sale. His orchard was well known in the area for its peaches and apples. And every fall, he pressed some of the apples into cider, which he let ferment and then distilled into hard cider. The Swains clothed themselves as well as feeding themselves. They exchanged some goods with their neighbors, their community. In the off-season, when there wasn't much work to do on the farm, Samuel made saddle trees. These were the frames that served as the basis for making leather saddles. He sold these locally, and his wife churned butter and made cheese. But all in all, only about one-fifth of what the Swain family produced was sold outside of their tiny village of East Marlborough Township. Most of the sales took place locally, and sometimes the parties settled accounts in cash. Cash was hard to come by, so they often bartered and exchanged goods for goods. For example, when Samuel had to hire workers for his farm, he frequently would pay them in wheat or potatoes or bacon. Of the goods requiring cash purchase, the most important were cloth, sugar from the West Indies, and books. Being Quakers, the Swain family was extremely interested in improvement of their minds. One of their most valuable possessions was a library of Quaker readings. If you had asked the Swains what their goals in life were, what their life goals were, they would have answered, and honestly answered, that their first, most important goal was being good parents and good Christians. They could have honestly said that they had no intention of getting rich, they had no intention of getting ahead in life. What they sought was a term often used in the 18th century, a competency. A competency. It meant a life that was comfortably above subsistence, safe from the ravages and misfortunes that could befall one, from disaster or from ruin, but it was far less than luxury. In fact, luxury itself was hard to obtain. It was also spiritually and politically dangerous, potentially corrupting the body and the spirit. Samuel and Hannah would likely have refused a life of luxury and indolence had it been offered to them. Something began to change in this world, however, between 1750 and 1850. And what changed was something that was neither sudden nor, at least at first glance, radical or revolutionary. At least it didn't seem that way. It was the slow, gradual transformation of this household economy into a more market-oriented economy. That is to say, the distances of exchange increased. Farmers now began to grow and sell products and exchange them over distances of hundreds of miles rather than just with their family or community or neighbors. More and more goods were imported from overseas. Fewer and fewer were made at home. Cash, rather than barter, became the centerpiece of the economy. Farmers oriented themselves to one cash crop, which they would sell for money to support themselves. It might be wheat in western Pennsylvania and New York. It might be corn in the hilly backcountry of Virginia. Sometimes the corn was fed to hogs, and the hogs were marched to market by the sound of the drover's cracking whip, the origin of the term cracker. It might be corn that was distilled into a potent drink that was called White Lightning in western Pennsylvania, or into bourbon in the county in Kentucky by the same name. But whatever the case, it was much more market-oriented. Maybe the most important change in this market economy was how people thought. Rather than thinking first and foremost about family subsistence, they thought in terms of an anonymous market. That's to say, a market that connected buyers and sellers over long distances, but buyers and sellers who didn't know each other, had no family or community or religious connection, who didn't even know, in fact, of each other's existence. It was a market of relationships that were now conducted in the cold, hard currency of cash, rather than reciprocal obligations and favors. Sorry, you have a question?
What exactly do you mean by market here?
I mean market. I mean a market of exchanges that takes place with money, that takes place between buyers and sellers who have no particular relationship with each other, as opposed to being made within the family or exchanged and bartered between neighbors and friends. So I mean the market as a set of relationships between people who simply produce goods and then sell them for whatever the going price is. And they don't know anything more about the goods, what happens to them, or who the buyers are, or what they do with them.
So this particular market that you're speaking about, is it something that is organized regularly, or is it something that is just kind of like a network situation and people just kind of spread the goods out over hundreds of miles?
Yeah, it's basically a network. It's not a formal, in the sense that there's a government that says this is the market and this is the price. This is something that develops between people as the distances spread out and as cash becomes more important to the economy, things like that. Right. The market world that at least parts of America were becoming was a place that was much better suited, at least to those whose main goal in life was accumulating wealth, accumulating money above all else. And for some people at least, this more market-oriented economy allowed them to indulge in the making of money on a grand scale. In the market world, it's extremely doubtful that anyone could have truthfully answered that profit and getting ahead were not important goals. The expansion of the market, however, only paved the way for something even more dramatic, and that was the transformation of New England into an industrial society. Now, first, let me talk a little bit about how the market created the opportunities that would lead to industrialism. In this more market-oriented world, agriculture moved westward. It expanded westward to take advantage of profitable opportunities on the western soils that were opening up in the 18th and 19th centuries. It moved agriculture from the thin, rocky topsoils of Massachusetts and Rhode Island and New Hampshire to the thick, rich, 10-foot-deep soils of Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana. As agriculture moved westward out of New England, land, labor, and capital were freed to do other things. And one of the things that replaced self-sufficient agriculture in New England were factories. New England became the textile center of America. Eventually, it would compete successfully with the first industrial nation of Old England.
Could you tell us about just a guess on the difference in yields from the soils in New England? Do you have any?
Off the top of my head, no. Let's just say it was a lot. An extreme a lot, yeah. I mean, New England does not have good soils for producing wheat, for example, or corn in abundance. So it meant quite a bit to be able to move out to the plains of Ohio, the Ohio Valley, that area. But let's talk about getting industry from Old England to New England. Let's talk about industrialization a little bit. Now, it was no easy task industrializing New England. It's true that commercialization of agriculture had sort of paved the way, as to say, to remove the problem of having England to supply its own food. But Great Britain, the first industrial nation, prohibited the exportation of the key machines of industrialization, the machines that spun cotton and wool into yarn and that wove yarn into fabric. That obstacle, however, was overcome when an English mechanic by the name of Samuel Slater smuggled the blueprints for spinning machines out of the country and sold them to the highest bidder in America. In 1790, with the sponsorship of a New England merchant named Moses Brown, Slater designed a mill that began producing the first machine-spun yarn in the New World. It was located in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. But even more difficult to get were the plans for the complex machinery that spun thread and yarn into cloth. Now, that was what really gave England its lead in textiles. And textiles were the first, at the time, most important industry of the early Industrial Revolution. Being able to integrate the processes of spinning thread and then weaving thread into cloth, that's what gave England its real advantage. But America, or New England in particular, took a long step towards competitiveness when a Boston merchant by the name of Francis Cabot Lowell visited those New England weaving factories between 1810 and 1812. And Lowell, a man of extraordinary intellectual accomplishments, was able to memorize the complex plans for those weaving machines. So even though suspicious British customs officials, who were not too happy about Slater's successful smuggling out of the blueprints earlier, even though customs officials searched Lowell's luggage twice, they were unable to find anything, and they couldn't stop him from remembering what he had seen. He went back to Boston, and there, with some partners, he founded the first large factory complex in America, an integrated spinning and weaving facility that opened in Waltham, Massachusetts in 1814. Then these men, Lowell and his partners, who became known as the Boston Associates, they took it all one step further. They planned and built a massive complex of textile spinning mills and took over the once sleepy town of Lowell, which is located a few miles north of Boston. In Lowell, they did other things, like construct canals to bring in swift-moving water which turned water wheels, which moved a spider's web of belts and pulleys, which operated the machines. And then water, and then later railroad transportation, came into the city to bring in supplies of raw cotton and take off the finished products to markets. The investors who created the Lowell system, the Lowell textile industry, also became promoters of railroads. They became builders of new financial institutions like banks and insurance companies. Just building factories wasn't enough because industrialism implied a new way of life. For example, where was the labor to come from to operate the textile machinery? Well, the answer was from the children and women of New England farmers whose farms had been made redundant by the movement of agriculture westward. Women and children worked in the factories of Lowell. and then in other factories around New England, men were also employed. After the potato famine blighted Ireland, Irish workers made their way to New England and into the factories as well, and a long process of industry pulling labor from overseas to work in factories was begun. But the Boston Associates had other concerns about the effects of industrialization. They wanted to assure themselves of adequate supplies of labor, to be sure, but they were also afraid. They were also afraid about the ill social effects that industrialization would breed. Would it produce slums and squalor, for example? So the early industrialists also began to regulate the lives of their workers, regulate them in a way that we would probably find intolerable today. In Lowell, they built dormitories for women and children workers to live in. And they hired women who only came recommended as having good character. They maintained a sort of parental supervision over their lives and their working hours. That meant watching who they associated with, regulating the hours that they slept and woke. Workers were expected to go to church, and companies also provided things like libraries for their moral improvement and uplift. However, when men began to replace women in the factories, especially immigrant men, this sort of parental supervision was relaxed. Despite efforts to stop it from happening, America began to develop a permanent working class, often foreign, often poor, working 12 hours a day, 6 days per week. Mill workers had little chance of becoming independent businessmen or independent farmers. The industrialists, however, were still concerned about the social effects of industry. So they tried to regulate and control this labor pool in many other ways. They sponsored things like institutions of social welfare in their town. They built churches and schools, and hospitals, and libraries. It was also during the first years of industrialization that America experienced its first temperance crusade, that is to say, a crusade to ban the sale of alcohol. Now, the temperance crusade was especially strong in the Northeast. In fact, especially strong right at the site of these early industrial mills. In 1830, Americans, on average, consumed about 7 gallons of pure alcohol per person per year. Mercifully for their livers, not all at once. But that was still about 3 times today's level of indulgence, 7 gallons of alcohol a year. We can expect that women drank less than men, and we also know that some people didn't drink at all, which meant that the level of consumption among working men was likely quite high. As elsewhere in the world, the introduction of industry also brought with it a regime of sort of hard, repetitive labor in the mills and a regime of hard drinking after hours. Temperance advocacy of regulating drinking, was extremely strong among the industrial leaders. What they wanted was a sober and industrious labor force. They wanted men who would stay at the task before the machines, hour in, hour out, with no breaks except those that were set by management. Now, these sorts of work routines, these were a far cry from the world of the farm or the world of the artisan shop or the world of the household economy that had been typical of the way most people lived. The sort of habits that industry required of workers had moved them into a strange world, a world that seemed to be composed of ceaseless toil before the pace and pattern set by machines. Before the Civil War, industrialization in the Northeast had introduced a whole series of social consequences and economic changes. Not only did they transform New England into a more industrialized society, but they also increasingly separated the worlds of the North and the South, the worlds above and below the Potomac. In 1840, by 1840, 36% of New England's labor force worked in industry. Only about 9.5% of the South was employed in industry. The North was the home of the Irish and later immigrants, very few immigrants went to the South. Cities arose in the North, and by 1850, 27% of the North's population lived in cities. Only about 9% of Southerners lived in cities. The work of men and women and children in the mills, that was maybe the most radical change of all. Machines and the skills that machines required, they came to define the North. Increasingly, the South remained wedded to rural life and to agriculture. Now, as grim as industry may have seemed for workers, it also offered other opportunities for advancement, at least for those who owned the machines and built the mills. And it was these opportunities, industrialization, and its effects that kept the rate of growth of the economy of the North ahead of that of the South. Remember, machines are complicated mechanisms. They break down. They need to be repaired. They need to be improved. By the 1840s, European visitors coming to America were stunned to find that America had created an entirely new system of production. They called it the American system. And it entailed what, from the perspective of the 20th century, we might look back and see as the first signs of mass production. The American system had some distinctive features. For example, it was much more capital intensive than traditional artisanal production. That is to say, it used machines at every opportunity, rather than hand labor, skilled labor. It involved centralizing the production of things into factories, rather than putting it out. The system was the putting out system, giving work to artisans who worked in small shops or in their homes. It involved standardization of parts so that machines could be made of assemblies of collections of identical or interchangeable parts, rather than constructed laboriously by hand and then fit and finished and put together one piece at a time. It involved setting up these machines so they would churn out hour in, hour out, identical parts at a far higher rate than a skilled worker could make them. It involved breaking down labor into unskilled or semi-skilled tasks, which could be done by younger or less skilled workers. The application of the American system to a variety of products, it worked wonders for business. Americans, for example, became the premier gunsmiths of the world. That was because federal armories, like those at Springfield, Massachusetts, Harper's Ferry, Virginia, used machines that would turn out identical parts of the gun, like the stock of the gun, 16 in the amount of time it took a hand laborer to do one. And then the identical parts could be brought together, final assembly, smoothly without any fitting or finishing. It was a far more efficient way to produce commodities or goods. Economists have a term called linkage. Linkage, it's a term of art in economics, and it's used to describe the relationships between different industries. It means simply that one activity often has consequences for another activity, often enhances another activity. So let me give you an example of how this worked and how it helped to transform the New England economy and make it so much wealthier than other parts of the United States. When they created the textile mills, New Englanders also created a demand for transportation to move the cotton to the north and the woven fabric out to the markets. The demand for transportation, that led to the building of roads and turnpikes, canals, and railroads. But railroads required things like steam engines, required construction companies to level and grade roadbed. It required civil engineers to build bridges across rivers so that railroads could travel across them. It increased the demand for iron and then later for steel to fabricate rails. Each of these activities, in turn, had further consequences. Iron mills needed coal and iron ore. That increased the demand for mining. the construction of engines or looms and spindles that required machinists who were capable of bending and grinding and shaping metal parts. And American machine tool producers, they made a whole range of grinding and drilling and polishing machines in order to mechanize the process of bending and shaping metal. Altogether, the American system increased the level of automation, standardization, interchangeable parts, precision tooling, all of which increased the quality of machinery, and all these machines could be applied to a wide variety of other industries and businesses. So, from the simple acorn of commercial farming and early textile mills, you got a rather mighty oak of northern industrialization. A lot of it was unexpected. It was even unplanned. And yet, it meant that the North was the fastest growing region of the United States, the wealthiest part of the United States. It set the stage for the United States' emergence after the Civil War as the #1 industrial nation of the world. Now, what's probably, in my mind, the most astounding linkage in this process was that which connected the machines and the factories to the human mind. Because industrialization was about more than just making money. It was certainly about making money, but it was also about a new way of viewing society, a new way of looking at the economy, a new way of looking at the natural environment. Industrialization became connected to the emergence of an open, innovative, even restless sort of mindset, business mind that sought to create or capture profitable opportunities wherever they emerged. Visitors to America were frequently amazed by this new mindset, which they identified especially with the North. They began to contrast the mind and worldview of Yankees and Southerners. In their recollections, they stress over and over again the habits of mind that lay behind an industrial society and the contrast between that and the habits of mind that lay behind a more traditional agrarian society. Even Thomas Jefferson observed this. He noted, in his many writings, he noted that the people of the North were, as he put it, cool, sober, laborious, persevering, interested, though he also found certain negative traits that went along with that. They could be chicaning, superstitious, and hypocritical in their religion. In his own South, Jefferson wrote that people were fiery, indolent, but also unsteady. Still, they were candid, they were generous, and they were unpretentious in their religion. Northerners and Southerners portrayed themselves in distinctive ways, ways which indicated different attitudes towards wealth. Let me give you an example. When the elite of the North had its pictures painted, they did so in portraits that stressed their industriousness or their diligence or their intelligence and reason. This picture you see here, one done by the famous portrait painter John Singleton Copley, it's of Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Mifflin of Philadelphia. Mifflin was a wealthy Philadelphia merchant. Notice that in the picture, he has his portrait painted, but he's holding his hand in a book, marking the page with his finger. It's as though he's just looked up for a moment from his serious reading in order to have his picture done. His wife, you might not be able to see the detail, but his wife is holding threads in her hand. She's spinning thread on a home spinning wheel, although it's extremely doubtful that the wife of this wealthy merchant needed to spin her own thread. What's going on here? There's another famous portrait, which some of you may have seen, also done by Copley. It's of Paul Revere, the famous patriot. It shows Paul Revere holding a teapot in one hand, looking like so, very contemplative. Now, it shows Revere less in his more famous role, riding the horse to warn people of the British coming to invade America, but it shows him in his daily occupation. Revere was a silversmith. It shows him holding something that he's made with his own hands, and it shows his tools of trade laid out in the table before him. Later on, New Englanders would have pictures of themselves painted in their daily occupation. So, for example, merchants would have their picture painted seated at a desk with their account books in front of them. Or else, during the era of industrialization, you'd see a picture of the industrialist standing before an open window with the factory and smokestacks visible in the background. When Northerners portrayed themselves, it was in what they did, how they earned their living, what they had materially accomplished. Now, the contrast between that and the South is rather striking. When Southerners portrayed themselves, it was not in what they accomplished or what they did. It was not in their material achievements, their industriousness, their reason, or in terms of their diligence at work. It was much more in terms of their refinement, their luxury, the accomplishments rather than the work itself were what Southerners stressed. I have maybe just enough time for one picture. This is a portrait of Colonel Bernard Elliott. Notice the contrast to the picture of, am I done? Should I stop? Okay.